Worthless. Completely worthless. Those were the words my father chose to describe me, and he said them loudly enough for everyone at the table to hear. The room went quiet for half a second before the laughter started, the kind of polite, uncomfortable laughter people use when they don't want to challenge the person speaking. My name is Evelyn Parker. I'm 63 years old, and that night I was sitting at the far end of a long oak table in a steakhouse just outside Dallas, a place where the ribeyes are thick, the sweet tea is cold, and families gather to celebrate birthdays, promotions, and anniversaries. My father, Robert Parker, had chosen the restaurant himself to celebrate his 79th birthday, and nearly the entire family had come. My younger cousins were there, my Aunt Linda, two of my nephews, and even a few family friends who had known us for decades. The table was crowded with plates, glasses, and the low hum of conversation, but when my father lifted his glass and began talking about the importance of hard work, the entire room gradually fell silent. At first it sounded like the usual speech he loved to give about discipline and responsibility, the kind of lecture I had heard since I was a teenager. Then he turned slightly in his chair and gestured toward me with a small, dismissive wave of his hand. Some people in this family understood the value of education, he said, his voice carrying across the table. And some people decided they'd rather drift through life without direction. I felt every pair of eyes shift toward me. My father took a sip of his bourbon and shook his head slowly, the way someone does when they want the audience to know they are disappointed. Evelyn here, he continued, never finished college. Never built a real career. If you want an example of wasted potential, well, he didn't even finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The message was already hanging in the air like smoke. Someone chuckled awkwardly. My cousin Mark looked down at his plate. Across the table my aunt gave me a quick sympathetic glance, but she said nothing. No one said anything. That was the way things had always worked in our family. When Robert Parker spoke, people listened. For most of my life, that had been enough to define who I was in everyone else's eyes. To them I was the daughter who disappeared years ago, the girl who left town with barely $200 and no clear plan, the one who never sent long letters and never came back for holidays. In their version of the story, I was the mistake in an otherwise respectable family. My father leaned back in his chair with a satisfied expression, clearly pleased with his little performance. The waiter arrived with another round of drinks, and the conversation slowly restarted around the table, but the label he had placed on me remained there, floating between us. Worthless. Uneducated. A disappointment. I picked up my glass of water and took a slow sip, letting the coolness settle my thoughts. After all these years, he still believed that story. The strange thing was that almost everyone else at the table believed it too. They had no idea who I really was. And in just a few minutes, that was about to change. For a moment I simply sat there, holding my glass and listening to the quiet murmur of conversation returning around the table. My father had already moved on to a different story, something about how hard he worked when he was young and how discipline had built everything he owned. People nodded along the way they always did when Robert Parker spoke. My cousin Mark even laughed at one of the jokes, although I could tell he was forcing it. That was the strange thing about my father. He had always been the loudest voice in the room, and after enough years people simply stopped questioning him. When someone tells the same story long enough, it eventually becomes the version everyone accepts. In my case, the story had been written decades ago. I was the daughter who had dropped out of college before finishing her degree. I was the one who packed a small suitcase, took $200 in cash, and left our house on a quiet afternoon without telling anyone exactly where I was going. According to my father, that was the day I threw my future away. He loved repeating that part. I could almost predict the next line before he said it. She had every opportunity, he would tell people, shaking his head with that familiar look of disappointment. But some people just do not have the discipline to succeed. Around the table that night, the same version of my life was quietly settling into place again. My Aunt Linda leaned slightly toward my cousin and whispered something behind her hand. My younger nephew glanced at me with curiosity, probably trying to understand why his grandfather had singled me out like that. And across from me, my father seemed completely satisfied with himself, swirling the ice in his glass as if he had just finished delivering a wise lesson to the entire family. I could have corrected him years ago. The truth is that I had many opportunities to speak up, to explain what had actually happened after I left home, to tell them about the years they knew nothing about. But silence can be a powerful shield. When people assume they already know your story, they stop asking questions. For a long time that worked in my favor. It allowed me to build a life quietly, without anyone watching too closely. Still, sitting there at that long restaurant table, hearing my father repeat the same judgment he had carried for more than 30 years, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly. It was closer to clarity. Because the version of Evelyn Parker that existed in his mind had been frozen in time since I was 22 years old. In his memory I was still the uncertain young woman who walked out the front door with no degree, no career, and no clear direction. He did not know about the city where I eventually settled. He did not know about the small office I rented above a mechanic shop during my first year on my own. He did not know about the long nights, the impossible decisions, or the quiet victories that followed. To him I was still the girl who failed. The truth was that the woman sitting at the end of that table had lived an entirely different life. And the most surprising part was that several people in that very restaurant had crossed paths with that life without ever realizing it. I set my glass down gently and looked around the table again. Everyone seemed relaxed now, convinced that the uncomfortable moment had already passed. My father continued talking, confident that his words had settled the matter once and for all. But something else was about to happen that none of them expected. Because for the first time in 30 years, I was finally considering the possibility that my father deserved to hear the truth. My father continued speaking as if nothing important had happened, leaning back comfortably in his chair while the soft clatter of silverware and quiet conversation filled the space around us. The waiter passed by with another tray of drinks, and the warm smell of grilled steak drifted through the room. To anyone watching from another table, we probably looked like a perfectly normal family celebrating a birthday dinner. My father lifted his glass again and began telling another story about the early years of his career, describing the long hours he spent working construction jobs across Texas. People nodded politely, and a few of my younger relatives listened with the kind of respectful attention that comes from hearing the same story many times before. I remained quiet, but my thoughts had already traveled far away from that restaurant. I was remembering the afternoon I left home more than 40 years earlier. I had been 22 years old at the time, standing in the driveway with a small suitcase that held little more than a few changes of clothes, a notebook, and the $200 I had saved from a part-time job. My father had stood on the porch with his arms crossed, telling me that leaving school was the biggest mistake I would ever make. In his mind, education followed by a predictable career path was the only definition of success. When I tried to explain that I wanted to build something on my own terms, he had dismissed the idea immediately. To him it sounded unrealistic, even foolish. That was the last serious conversation we had before I drove away from the house where I had grown up. Back then I did not have a perfect plan. I simply knew that if I stayed in that small town, every decision I made would be judged through my father's expectations. So I drove nearly 800 miles west until the familiar highways of Texas slowly gave way to a city where no one knew my last name and no one expected anything from me. The first place I lived was a small studio apartment above a repair garage. The building smelled like motor oil and fresh asphalt most days, and the summer heat inside. Those walls could reach well above 90 degrees even with the windows open. But it was mine, and that feeling alone was enough to keep me moving forward. I worked several different jobs during those early years, learning everything I could about business, logistics, and the complicated rhythm of supply chains that keep cities running. The work was not glamorous. Some days I spent hours organizing paperwork in tiny offices, and other days I drove across town delivering documents or meeting people who were willing to explain how the industry worked. Slowly, piece by piece, I began to understand opportunities that other people overlooked. Meanwhile, back in Texas, the story of my failure continued to grow without me there to challenge it. My father told relatives that I had disappeared because I could not handle responsibility. Family gatherings came and went, and my name was mentioned less and less often. That version of events became comfortable for everyone involved. It was easier to believe that the girl who left home had simply vanished into an ordinary life somewhere far away. Sitting at that restaurant table decades later, listening to my father repeat the same assumptions, I realized something important. The truth about my life had never been hidden because it was secret. It had remained invisible because no one in this family had ever cared enough to ask what actually happened after I walked out that front door. I watched the candles flicker in the center of the table while my father continued his speech, completely unaware of how much of my life he had never seen. The years after I left home had not been easy, but they had been meaningful in a way that surprised even me. The first real opportunity came from a man named Harold Jennings who owned a small regional shipping company on the outskirts of Phoenix. At the time I was working in a modest office that handled freight paperwork for several transportation businesses. Most people treated the job as temporary work, but I treated it like a classroom. Every shipment that crossed my desk told a story about how goods moved across the country. Furniture from North Carolina, electronics from California, machinery traveling between industrial parks in the Midwest. I began noticing patterns in the routes and delays that other people ignored. One afternoon Harold Jennings came into the office frustrated about a late delivery that had cost him an important client. Instead of simply apologizing like the other clerks usually did, I showed him a map I had been sketching in my notebook. It was nothing fancy, just pencil lines connecting distribution centers and interstate highways, but it revealed a faster route his drivers could take if they reorganized their schedule. Harold studied the page quietly for a moment before asking me a question no one in my family had ever asked. He asked where I learned to think that way. The truth was that I had taught myself by studying shipping records during slow hours and reading business books from the public library at night. Harold eventually offered me a small consulting role helping him reorganize his delivery routes. The pay was modest, but it opened a door that changed everything. Over the next several years I worked with multiple companies that needed help understanding how to move goods more efficiently across long distances. The United States is a country built on highways and rail lines, and once I understood how those systems connected cities together I realized something important. The real opportunity was not in driving the trucks or loading the cargo. The opportunity was in coordinating the movement of everything behind the scenes. Eventually I saved enough money to start a small logistics service of my own. At first it operated from a single rented office with 2 desks and a used computer that hummed loudly whenever it processed large spreadsheets. I answered every phone call myself and spent long nights planning routes that could save companies time and fuel costs. Slowly the business grew. One client became 3, then 6, then a dozen. Every successful contract led to another recommendation. By the time 10 years had passed, the small service I started above that noisy garage had expanded into a company that coordinated shipments across several states. Meanwhile, the story in my hometown remained exactly the same. According to my father, I had left because I lacked direction. According to my relatives, I had probably settled somewhere ordinary, living a quiet life far away from the expectations I could not meet. Sitting at the restaurant table now, I realized how strange that assumption truly was. While my father believed I had disappeared into failure, the work I started all those years ago had quietly grown into something much larger than anyone in this room could imagine. And the most surprising part was that the consequences of that work were already closer to this family than they realized. I looked around the table again and noticed how relaxed everyone seemed now that the earlier moment had faded into the background. My father had shifted the conversation toward his favorite subject, the story of how he built his construction company from nothing but determination and long hours under the Texas sun. He spoke proudly about waking up before sunrise, driving across dusty highways to job sites, and teaching his workers the value of discipline. No one interrupted him. That was another constant in our family. When Robert Parker spoke about success, people listened as though his version of the world was the only one that existed. My cousin Mark nodded along while cutting into his steak, and my Aunt Linda sipped her iced tea with the patient smile she always used during my father's speeches. Meanwhile, I sat quietly, realizing just how much the world had changed since the last time I attended one of these family dinners. The small logistics company I started all those years ago had continued growing long after those first fragile years. After the 10th year, we expanded beyond regional routes and began coordinating freight between distribution hubs across the Southwest. Technology changed quickly during that time, and I made sure our systems adapted faster than most competitors. While many older shipping companies relied on outdated planning methods, my team built software tools that tracked routes, delivery times, and fuel costs in real time. Those improvements attracted larger clients who needed dependable national coordination. One contract turned into 5, and 5 eventually became dozens. Warehouses in Arizona, Nevada, and California began routing shipments through our network because we could move products faster and with fewer delays. The office above the mechanic shop eventually became too small, so we moved into a modest building on the edge of Phoenix with a view of Interstate 10 stretching across the desert. I still remember standing by the window on the first day in that new office, watching the steady stream of trucks heading east and west across the country. Every one of those highways represented possibility. Over the next 2 decades, the company expanded again and again, building partnerships with distribution centers in several major cities. We hired analysts, dispatch coordinators, and operations managers who understood how to scale the system we had created. By the time the business celebrated its 25th anniversary, the network we built helped coordinate shipments across more than half the country. Most people outside the industry had never heard my name, and that was perfectly fine with me. Quiet success can be far more stable than public recognition. Back at the restaurant table, my father raised his voice again as he reached the end of another story about perseverance. Hard work and education, he said firmly, tapping the table with his finger. That is the only path to real success. A few relatives murmured their agreement. I could not help noticing the irony of that statement. The company I built had recently signed a major contract with an investment group that funded transportation infrastructure across multiple states. Their financial backing allowed us to expand even further, adding new distribution partnerships throughout Texas. In fact, several warehouses within 100 miles of this very restaurant now depended on the logistics network my team had developed. The trucks carrying those shipments passed through highways my father probably drove every week without realizing who was coordinating the routes behind the scenes. I took another sip of water and listened as the conversation shifted toward local business news. My father mentioned a recent investment opportunity he had been excited about, a transportation company that promised strong returns over the next few years. As he spoke, a quiet realization settled into my mind. The name he had just mentioned sounded very familiar, because the company he was proudly describing was not just another business in the industry. It was part of the network my own company had acquired less than a year earlier. My father leaned forward slightly as he continued talking about the investment opportunity, clearly pleased with himself. It is a smart move, he said, tapping the edge of his glass with one finger. Transportation logistics is where the real money is going now. Warehouses, shipping routes, distribution networks. That is the future. My cousin Mark looked impressed. So you bought shares in that company you mentioned? He asked. My father nodded proudly. Not just shares. I invested a solid amount. The firm expanding the network is supposed to be one of the most efficient operators in the entire region. I listened carefully, letting every word settle in my mind. The name he had mentioned only a moment earlier echoed quietly in my thoughts because it was not just another transportation company. It was a mid-sized distribution group based in Houston that my team had acquired through a strategic partnership 11 months earlier. The purchase had been part of a larger expansion plan that connected several Texas freight corridors to the national logistics network my company had spent decades building. At the time the deal closed, it barely made headlines outside the industry, but inside transportation circles it had been considered a major move. I folded my hands calmly on the table while my father continued explaining his investment strategy as if he were revealing a brilliant discovery to the entire family. "You have to understand how the system works," he said confidently. "These companies run the routes that keep stores stocked and factories moving. If you get in early, the returns will be excellent." My Aunt Linda nodded politely. "Well, that certainly sounds promising," she said. My father smiled, clearly enjoying the attention. "Of course it is promising. I did my research." I noticed that several relatives were now listening with interest, including my younger nephew who looked fascinated by the idea of trucks and shipping routes crossing the country. For a moment I simply watched my father speak, studying the same confident expression he had worn for most of my life. The difference now was that I understood exactly how the system he described actually worked. The company he believed he had carefully researched was operating under a larger corporate structure that my own organization controlled. The investment group he admired so much had partnered with us because we had the logistics infrastructure they needed to expand into Texas. My father did not know any of that. To him it was just another promising business opportunity. The irony of the situation was almost difficult to ignore. For more than 30 years he had repeated the same belief about my life, convinced that I lacked direction or ambition. Yet at this very moment he was proudly describing an investment connected directly to the company I had spent decades building. I picked up my glass again and took a slow sip of water while the conversation continued around the table. My father leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he had just delivered valuable advice. Then he glanced in my direction again with that familiar look of disappointment that had followed me since I was young. "Of course," he added casually, "none of that would make sense to someone who never finished school." A few people shifted awkwardly in their seats, clearly recognizing that he had directed the comment toward me again. For the first time that evening I felt a quiet certainty settle into my mind. The moment I had been considering since the beginning of this dinner was finally approaching. Because my father had just unknowingly described a business that I knew better than anyone else in this room. The table grew quieter after my father made his last comment, the one about school and understanding business. It was the kind of remark he had made countless times before, usually followed by silence from everyone else. For most of my life those words would have ended the conversation. People would look down at their plates, someone would change the subject, and the moment would pass as if nothing had happened. Tonight felt different. I rested my hands calmly on the table and looked at my father for a moment. Robert Parker had always carried the same confidence, the same certainty that his view of the world was correct. Even now, at 79 years old, he spoke with the same authority that once filled the halls of our house when I was a teenager. The difference was that tonight I was no longer the uncertain young woman who had walked out of that house decades ago. Around us the restaurant hummed with quiet conversation and the clinking of glasses. My cousin Mark glanced toward me again, clearly sensing that something in the air had changed. My Aunt Linda was watching carefully too, her expression thoughtful as if she could feel that the evening had reached a turning point. I let a few seconds pass before speaking, giving the room time to settle. "Dad," I said calmly, my voice steady enough that several people at the table turned toward me immediately. My father raised an eyebrow slightly, surprised that I had chosen to respond at all. For years I had remained silent during these moments, allowing his version of my life to go unchallenged. "You might be right about one thing," I continued. "I never finished college." The statement seemed to confirm what everyone already believed, and my father gave a small nod as if he had expected exactly that response. But I was not finished speaking. I leaned back slightly in my chair and looked around the table, making brief eye contact with several relatives who were now watching with growing curiosity. What most people here probably do not know, I said slowly, is what happened after I left home. The room had become noticeably quieter now. Even the waiter passing by slowed for a moment as he noticed our table had gone silent. My father crossed his arms, clearly prepared to hear another explanation that would fit the story he had repeated for so many years. Instead, I continued speaking in the same calm tone. When I left Texas, I moved to Phoenix and started working in freight coordination. It was not a big job at first. Mostly paperwork and delivery records. But over time I learned how the entire shipping network worked across the country. My cousin Mark leaned forward slightly. My younger nephew looked fascinated. My father, however, still seemed unconvinced. To him it probably sounded like a small and ordinary career. Eventually I started my own logistics company, I added. At the beginning it was just a small operation with a couple of desks and one computer. My father gave a faint shrug as if the information did not mean much to him. I could almost see the thought forming in his mind that a small company started by someone without a degree could not possibly become anything significant. That assumption was exactly why I had never rushed to explain my life before. I paused briefly, then continued speaking with the same steady voice. Over the years that company expanded. We built distribution partnerships across several states, and eventually our network began coordinating freight routes for warehouses throughout the Southwest. I watched my father's expression carefully. For the first time that evening, his confidence seemed to waver slightly. The room remained completely still as I prepared to say the one thing that would connect everything he had been talking about tonight. The silence around the table deepened as everyone waited for me to finish. My father was still leaning back in his chair, but the confident smile he had worn earlier was beginning to fade. I kept my voice calm and steady. The same tone I had used during countless business meetings over the years. The company continued growing, I said, looking around the table briefly before my eyes returned to him. After a while we were not just managing local routes anymore. We were coordinating freight between major distribution hubs across several states. My cousin Mark shifted in his seat, clearly trying to understand where this story was going. My Aunt Linda placed her glass down slowly and watched me with quiet attention. Even my younger nephew had stopped eating, his fork hovering above his plate. I continued speaking without raising my voice. Eventually we expanded into Texas as well. Warehouses near Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio started using our network to move shipments more efficiently across the region. My father frowned slightly at that, as if the detail had finally caught his attention. For the first time that evening he seemed to be listening carefully instead of waiting for his turn to speak. I folded my hands together on the table. That expansion happened because we partnered with an investment group that wanted to strengthen transportation infrastructure across the Southwest. My father nodded slowly. Yes, he said, almost automatically. That is exactly the type of company I was talking about earlier. I gave a small, thoughtful nod. I know. The single word seemed to settle over the table like a quiet signal. My cousin Mark leaned forward slightly. Wait, he said cautiously. Are you saying your company works with the same group Uncle Robert invested in? I looked at him briefly before answering. Not exactly, I said calmly. Then I turned my attention back to my father. His eyes narrowed slightly now, the confidence in his posture replaced by curiosity. Dad, I said, keeping my voice even. The distribution company you mentioned earlier, the one based in Houston that you were so excited about investing in, that company is part of my network. The room went completely still. No one spoke for several seconds. My father blinked once as if he had not heard me correctly. What do you mean? He asked slowly. I held his gaze. Last year my company acquired a controlling partnership in that business, I explained. They operate under our logistics system now. Their routes, their shipping coordination, their expansion into new markets, all of it runs through the infrastructure we built. My cousin Mark looked from me to my father and back again, clearly trying to process what he had just heard. My Aunt Linda covered her mouth slightly in surprise. My father remained silent for a moment, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "You are telling me," he said carefully, "that the company I invested in is connected to the business you started?" I gave a small nod. "Yes," I replied quietly. "The logistics network they rely on was designed by my team. And the company that oversees that network," I paused briefly, letting the weight of the moment settle across the table. Then I finished the sentence in the same calm voice I had used from the beginning. "That company belongs to me." No one at the table spoke for several seconds after my words settled into the quiet air of the restaurant. The sound of dishes from other tables and the distant murmur of conversations around us suddenly seemed much louder than before. My father stared at me as if he were trying to decide whether he had misunderstood what I said or whether the meaning was exactly as clear as it sounded. My cousin Mark slowly leaned back in his chair, his eyes moving between the two of us. My Aunt Linda looked down at the tablecloth and then back up at me again, her expression somewhere between surprise and disbelief. I did not raise my voice or repeat the statement. I simply sat there calmly, allowing the truth to settle naturally into the space between us. My father finally cleared his throat and adjusted his posture in the chair. The confidence he carried earlier in the evening had shifted into something quieter, something more uncertain. "You are telling me that the logistics company running that network is yours," he said carefully. I nodded once. "Yes." He looked down at the table for a moment, as if mentally reviewing every comment he had made since the dinner began. I could almost see the realization forming piece by piece in his mind. The stories about discipline, the remarks about education, the comment about people who would not understand how business works. All of it had been said with complete certainty only minutes earlier. Around us the rest of the family remained silent, waiting to see how he would respond. For most of my life my father had always been the person with the final word in any conversation. This time he seemed to be searching for one. I felt no anger as I watched him. The years had softened whatever resentment once existed between us. What I felt instead was a quiet sense of clarity. The version of me he had repeated for decades no longer had anywhere to stand. Finally my father looked back up at me. His voice was lower now, less certain than before. "I did not know," he said. I gave a small nod. "No," I replied calmly. "You did not." Another long pause settled over the table. Then I reached for my glass of water and took a slow sip before placing it back down. "But that is the interesting thing about assumptions," I added gently. "They tend to survive for years when no one bothers to ask the full story." My father did not argue with that. For the first time all evening he simply sat quietly, absorbing what had been said. Around the table the tension slowly began to ease as relatives exchanged uncertain glances. The dinner continued eventually, but the atmosphere had changed in a way that was impossible to ignore. As for me, I felt strangely peaceful. I had not come back to prove anything or embarrass anyone. The truth had simply arrived at the table at the same moment my father finished explaining how success worked. And sometimes that was all the explanation a story ever needed.